I'd like to thank you all for coming to this second of our lunchtime talks for this semester, where we squeeze people in here at the Mary McCarthy House, and I try and get the RSVPs down, so I'm sorry it's a little tight, but that means we have more people to enjoy it. I'm very happy today that we have with us Bernard Debarbieux from University of Geneva, who's current in Switzerland, yes, who's currently spending, I think, a semester at Vassar College just down the way. Bernard has a connection with Bard through Dean Michel Dominy, who I guess worked with Bernard at some point?
Together on a conference that we organized in 2000.
10 years ago. Yeah.
Okay, great. So that's how he came to us. He's the author, co-author with Gilles Rudas of a book, Les Fissures des Montagnes, The Makers of Mountains, of the Mountain, which has the distinction of having two covers. One that was a mistake and one that's real. He tells me that he's currently in discussions with the University of Minnesota Press to bring out an English translation, which we hope will happen. He joined the University of Geneva staff in 2001, and his field is geography. Not something we have a lot of here, although I think we have one or two professors of geography on the faculty, or people whose work is in geography. And he specializes in the geographical knowledge and imagination of political and collective territorialities. And his main objects of research are mountains and memorials. But today he's going to speak to us about a paper he recently published, or is about to come out, titled The Political Meaning of Landscape Through the Lens of Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition. So he's going to speak for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we will have a discussion. So thank you, Bernard.
Okay, thank you very much, Roger. Thank you for all of you to be here. This is a very challenging presentation for me, first because my English is not so good, and I hope you are going to forgive me for that. Second, because probably many of you are very good specialists of Hannah Arendt, and I'm not. I pretend to talk about what she wrote, but I'm not a specialist at all, so maybe I have much more to learn from you that you are going to learn from me. But anyway, I agree with the idea of discussing this in a very informal way, if you want. And the third challenge is, as you said, Roger, I am a geographer, probably the only one in this room, specialized in cultural and political geography, and geographers, and I will tell you why later, are not very used to refer to Hannah Arendt for reasons that I can explain to you in a couple of minutes. But personally, I found her very, very stimulating and very useful for present time, present day geography. So that's why I am taking some of my time for reading her and trying to having a specific interpretation of what she did. I have been working on her writings at in two circumstances. The first one was 3 or 4 years ago, and it led to this paper you mentioned, and that many of you probably received for preparing this session today. And this paper is going to be printed only probably next June. The MIT Press, this is a chapter of a book edited by Jeff Malpass, a philosopher, Australian philosopher, who is specialized in philosophy of place and space. And he has had a lot of trouble with MIT Press, so the text has been written a few years ago, and I would not probably write it the same now, but it doesn't matter so much. And this was 3 or 4 years ago when I was working a lot on the concept of landscape, which is a concept that Hannah Arendt never used as far as I know, so which was also a challenge. And I have been working on her writings again during the last few months, because I am working on a more general and maybe ambitious theory of space and spatialities. And I find that what she wrote is very stimulating for someone like me who is trying to have a very wide conception and interpretation of spatialities of modernitism. So, if you don't mind, I will start with a very short presentation of this very recent questions I'm working on, because it is the widest and the more general, and after that I will comment my own text on landscape, even if it was written before. Why do I find Hannah Arendt interesting if, as a geographer working on theory of space in modernity, is that because in many of her writings, space is everywhere. She had a lot of books and papers and commentaries where she focused on place, world, territory, these kind of things. She never wrote, as far as I know, a comprehensive interpretation of her whole, or proposal of her own conception of what is space and how space matters. But, and you probably know that, in many of her writings, you have a lot of insistence given to one or another of these concepts, and this is a very short quotation taken from The Origin of Totalitarianism, where there are plenty of words related to space, probably more than any geographer would put in 2 or 3 sentences like this. This quotation is related to a section of the book, the end of the book, where she mentioned the concept of rightless and rightlessness. And as you can see, and I put them in bold characters, she used the concept of home, she used the concept of place, she used the concept of world, she used the concept of earth, the concept of country, the concept of territory, and last but not least, the concept of space. And she has a wide vocabulary for talking about space, and the vocabulary which could seem at first glance very bricolé, we would say in French, made of pieces without a general view and without general currents, because she never explained any kind of currents in her own way of using the idea of speciality. But I am personally convinced that there is a very strong current in all this mention of specialities, and this is the kind of things I'm working on, so I'm going to give a few hints of what I see in that, but I'm not sure yet, and if someone disagrees totally in the audience, I would be very happy to know that. Just a first hint. I took these 3 very small pieces in this quotation just for reminding you that in only 2 sentences, like in this quotation, you have mention of spatiality as understood by phenomenology, the concept of place, the concept of world, which is her basis philosophy, of course. A mention of place and earth, much more like physical location, objective realities, objective elements of reality. The concept of territory, which is in Arendt's world very much juridical and secondary political, but mainly juridical. And these areas of meanings of these concepts are totally different and not explicitly articulated. What I think personally is that all these concepts are very much hierarchized, thank you, hierarchized, and very much dependent from one another. Hierarchized because the most important thing when talking about space and spatiality in her writings, the most important concept is the concept of place and world, because of the phenomenological grounding of her philosophy, and all the others are defined according to this first, this priority. So that's why any kind of objective designation of place or of location is related to a phenomenological point of view. And another important thing that you probably know is that even the concept which is absent in this quotation of public space and private space, both of them being related to one of the many meanings given to the concept of space in her writings, even the concept of public space is related to the idea that for having a public space somewhere, you need to have what you call the territory, which is the basic unit of political spatiality, which allows freedom to exist And since, thanks to this speciality, thanks to the freedom given by the existence of territory, you can build public space. So this is two illustrations of this implicit but very strong relation between the different spatial concepts she used. But she never wrote anything about that, so this is personal speculation, but I think I could be, with a couple of months of work, more secure to make this kind of statement related to her proposal. What is especially interesting for understanding why she probably never wrote anything related to space specifically is the end of this quotation, or what is written before. It was a problem not of space, but of political organizations. She never, as far as I know, has any kind of statement related to space exclusively. Anything which is related to space in her writings relates to individuals, relates to states, relates to nation, relates to international relations, all these kind of things, relates to actors, stakeholders, individuals. So she is not at all a theoretician of space, but she uses spatial concept all the time. This is probably she doesn't, and she never wrote anything specific about space, and this is probably geographers have never been very much interested in her work, because probably 95% of the history of geography is a history of a science who talk about space, and secondary of people, nations, individuals, these kind of things. Space is first, and the others are later or of less importance. This is not anymore the case in geography, and probably I am one of them, one of the geographers who are trying to reassess the geographical scope, especially in cultural and political geography. And that's why it's very interesting for me to read Arendt, because she has very strong proposals related to space, which are very fruitful for someone who is trying to take some distance with space or reintroduce a conception of space highly related to individual, social and political relations. So this was the first things I wanted to tell you, and this is my actual work, trying to deepen this kind of analysis and be again more secure with the kind of statement I am, or I may be able to make in the following months. I told you just before that 3 or 4 years ago I discovered for the first time Hannah Arendt, thanks to a colleague of mine who is a philosopher, a French philosopher, but also very much interested in geography, because he was knowing that I was trying to make to publish papers related to landscape and modernity, and very present-day issues related to landscape. What does it mean when we talk about landscape today? And I am convinced that it's not related at all with what was landscape even half a century ago. And he told me that what you say is not exactly, but you should read The Human Condition. In The Human Condition, you have a proposal where Arendt never used the word of landscape again, but you have a formal proposal which can help you a lot to organize your own statement related to landscape and modernity. And in Human Condition, you have this very famous, now I know it's famous, but 4 years ago I didn't know it was, but very famous for people who have been working with Arendt's concept, trilogy of activities: labor, work, and action. I probably don't have to define anything of this trilogy, I hope, because you would probably do it better than I would, especially in English again. But just in a very easy way, just reminding that labor relates to what she calls homo laborans, work to homo faber, homo who makes sustainable things, and action to homo politicus. And this trilogy, as you know, has not been used by Hannah Arendt for talking again about space, because this has never been her own objective. And neither space nor landscape, of course. And I found it, and my friend was really helpful in that way, I found it very useful for understanding the three different conceptions we had of landscape since the Renaissance, and successive or complementary or contradictory conception of landscape we have had during these last 5 centuries. Just for illustrating this point, and those of you who have seen this paper already know much more than what I am going to say now. As you probably know, the concept of landscape has been used, especially since the end of the 18th century, for designating a portion of reality itself. Not through representation, not through painting, not through poetry, but the reality by itself. And realistic painting, like this kind of painting made in the early 19th century, has played an important role for transmitting this idea that landscape is a part of reality itself. But this is a painting. So what it is about? Reality, the reality of the earth as it appears from someone who is in the top of a hill or a mountain in the Swiss Alps, or is it the painting itself? The whole story of the concept of landscape from the Renaissance to the 18th century is somehow between the reality and its representation. It's never clear, never very clear. And what is interesting for me is that landscape became a way of describing the geographical reality from the end of the 18th century, thanks to painting, which was the main way of producing images of the reality before photography or these kind of things. So this painting, especially, drawn by Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, who is a very famous French portraitist of the French Revolution and before the French Revolution, and she did only one landscape painting, that one. A very famous one because this is the only historical record of the first edition of a very famous popular feast in the Swiss Alps. Very important for the Swiss nationalism, but forget about this, it's not important here. And this is a very interesting moment of the history of landscape, where landscape is a reality which derives from the action of people on the woods, on the pastures, on the mountains. So landscape as a piece of reality, but as you already understood, landscape conceived as the result or the output of labor, labor conceived that as an Arendt concept, and at the same time, it's a representation, it's a painting, so it's a work of art, by the way. So both landscape as labor and landscape as work of art are displayed in this painting, and they are highly complementary. Except that labor was before the work itself, in this case. Vigée-Lebrun needed to have Swiss peasants, mountain people, working and living for centuries in the Swiss Alps for making the work of art itself. So the relation between labor and work is not an equal relation. There was labor first and work afterwards. During the following century, but it was also the case during Vigée-Lebrun's century, the end of the 18th century, you have this new profession and the new way of doing, which we call landscaping, and Olmsted, worldwide famous landscape architect, and especially in this country, of course, is probably one of the most prominent of this kind, promoted a totally different conception of landscape, landscape as work of art by itself, but not work of art on the canvas of a painting, but work of art in the reality. So again, the relation between representation and reality is moving. It was already the case in England in the late 18th century when this idea of landscaping was invented, mainly by Lancelot Brown. But Olmsted was the one who probably did it at the biggest or largest scale in a very impressive way. So what happened? You had landscape in Central Park over there, or in Montreal. Here, at the very top of Montreal, where landscape is a work on art, but in the reality. Does it mean that there is no more labor in the composition? Yes, there is labor of the people who work for him, because the labor related to landscape became the word of the work of the labor. I mean, the labor of laborers, of workers who were hired by the landscape architect. So again, you have a combination between labor and work, but the arrow is in the other direction. The initiative is in the hand of Olmsted and in the hand of the landscape architects, and the labor is derived from the work itself. Now, what about action? And this is because landscape is nowadays action for me, and no more so much labor and work, that the trilogy, Arendt's trilogy, is very useful. I am very surprised, and this is exactly what I've been working on during these days, these years, I mean, 3 or 4 years ago. I have been following a lot all this public participation, public debates related to our landscape. The landscape of our town, the landscape of our city, the landscape of Mont-Royal in Montreal, for example, which has been a very huge and very, very polemical discussion in Montreal, but you probably have personal examples in your own town or regions or these kind of things. And landscape became, and you probably noted that during the last 10 years, a more and more political and more and more polemical topic, issue, and topic of discussion, because it became more and more important to think about the visual identity of the place we live in, especially if you have political responsibilities, and because more and more people are attached to what is the quality of the landscape in the places where they live in. And since landscape became such an open topic of discussion, and not so much the accidental, non-intentional, unintentional product of labor, and not only the product of work of artists, of landscape architects, it's more and more political and more a topic which is, as could have said Hannah Arendt, a topic that to put on the table, and all the people who are around the table are making a kind of public space, talking about not the table itself, but the space that the table occupies. And landscape today, not everywhere, but in many places, occupies especially this kind of space. This is a political and public topic of discussion where specific spaces are open for discussing this common issue. So this was the example of Mont-Royal. I could be much longer on this if you would like, but not for the moment probably. A very interesting website was organized, and you have a map here on the right of this slide, which gives you an idea of the way the discussion was organized. You have a lot of debates in several places of the city around the year 2000 and 2001, but you had also this interactive map where you could click on any of these numbers, the blue written white in blue, and if you click in one of these numbers, you had the related pictures telling you how look like the Mont-Royal from the place you clicked on. So this was a very interesting interactive way of presenting the different landscape of Mont-Royal, especially through the internet.
Bernard, could you say a little bit more about what's going on with this Mont-Royal? I mean, I don't know the whole history of the debate or what's going on. Okay. Why Montreal first is important for people from Montreal? It's first because, and you can see it from this map of Montreal in the 30s. Montreal is at the very center of a very flat plain, and at this very center you have a very strange hill. The people in Montreal like to call it the mountain, but it's a very small mountain, by the way. So we would say now that it's more a hill, and the growth of the city surrounded the whole place very quickly during the late 18th century, 19th century and early 20th century, and now it's at the very middle of the city. So, as far as I know, Montreal is one of the very few cities in the world whose center is
hill and a very green, almost natural piece of landscape. And this mountain, Mont Royal, has been used for